I'm Scott Allen Miller, and this is Sam IT. This is where we talk about everything involving business and information technology. We really look at this from an academic perspective. We want to do a lot of education and kind of look at this as we would often do in a postgraduate program. We want to look at the reasons why things actually work and why things are the way they are, because this is what really allows us to dive into our field, our craft, and understand and grow. And today we're going to be continuing a series that we started about 2 weeks ago on what is email. We're going to delve deep into email systems. And today, in part 2, we're actually going to talk about something that is completely and utterly not email. And trust me, this is going to be an important foundation for what we're going to be talking about going forward. So today we're going to talk about bulletin board systems, or BBSs. Now, a little history. If we go back in time to the early 1980s, and maybe these existed before then, but I'm not aware of them existing before about 1982 or so. At that time, we didn't have, at least available to normal people, of course, military or universities were starting to have access to ARPANET. There were really large corporations that sometimes had access to digital communications but in general, networking between entities did not exist. We didn't really see that with heavy prevalence in large organizations until the late 1980s. We didn't see it starting to be in the common consciousness until the early 1990s. And we didn't see the internet broadly available for people until the late 1990s. So we're talking about a very different time period in the early 1980s. Things were not at all like you picture today. Yes, computers were starting to be available, but they were isolated. Big companies typically had mainframes or other really giant computers, mini computers, PDP-11s, things like that, IBM System 360s. Those systems would then have terminals. They would not have networking to connect computers together. Networking was generally something that came later. Not that the concept didn't exist yet, but for all intents and purposes, it was not accessible to normal people, and even most businesses, it was out of their reach. So that is not something we had. So concepts like email didn't really exist yet because there was no ability to connect systems together. So how could you have messaging? Because that was still important. It was still, we needed to get messages between people. How did we do that? So bulletin board systems and things like them became the tools that made sense at that time in the pre-intercomputer messaging era. This was the intra-computer messaging era. Sorry, the wind picked up there and I was getting light on the lens. So in the intra-computer messaging era, that means that we were needing to send messages to other people on the same computer system. And this sounds crazy today. Of course, you could do it. If you ask someone, could you send a message to someone else who's on the same computer as you, you'd say, how often is someone on the same computer as me? Not very often. But if I did need to, that probably wouldn't be too hard. We're on the same computer. Okay. And so today it seems weird, but remember, we're talking about people who mostly used mainframe systems. We're not talking about people on their Commodore 64 or VIC-20 or Apple IIe. We're talking about people on a PDP-11 or other system where you may have hundreds or thousands of users connected to terminals that are not networked but are all connected over serial communications directly to the same computer. This is weird today, but go see some of my videos about green screens and other legacy technologies. This is how we worked during this era when you needed multiple users on a system. It was a big deal to call things a multi-user computer system because it was relatively rare. What we were used to was single-user computer systems like the VIC-20, like an Apple IIe, even like Windows 95. These systems only allowed one user at a time. If you were done, you got up, another person could sit down and continue using your computer. But multi-user systems allowed many users to be connected to the same computer at the same time. One CPU, one set of RAM, one system of disks. Everyone shared that capacity. And when those systems, primarily business systems at first, needed to share messages between people because they needed to send messages from one employee to another, from one person to another, from a student to a teacher, just the same then as we do now with email to communicate to our boss, to let them know we're going to be late for work, to send a proposal to a client, to tell our professor what our essay is in American history, whatever those things are. We needed to do those things then as well. but we didn't have email. They didn't have another computer. We were all on a single computer. So what arose was a bulletin board system, and in some cases just isolated messaging systems, but this entire class of messaging system became known as bulletin board systems. And how it worked was, in most cases, there's multiple mechanisms to this, but this concept, this paradigm arose and became incredibly popular all through the 1980s, well into the 1990s, and was still going in the early 2000s, but in different forms, and we'll talk about that. You would go onto the system, you would connect to a messaging client in most cases, normally just text-based, so it's not something that you had to load on a GUI, because they didn't have GUIs. Everything was text-based, right? So you may not have noticed. It may seem like you were just on the computer, and you would open a client that would write a message, mostly just a text file, and drop it into the appropriate spot for whoever you needed to send it to. Now, this was easier than email because you didn't need to specify that I'm sending this to Becky at and the name of her server, because it didn't have to go anywhere. You're on the same server. So if her name is Becky on the system, you only had to specify that the message was for Becky. That was it. She would get it because it would take care of the rest simply by assigning it to her. So what we ended up with is basically just a really simple system for making text files, providing some security, assigning them to a person, notifying that person when they logged in, there was no other time to tell them that a message was waiting for them, or that they had to check their messaging system to see if there were messages and read those messages later. It's basically a store and forward system without the forwarding. It was just storing. So it was very basic, but you can see why this was useful. If I was working during the day and I needed to get a message to Becky who worked the night shift, I could leave a message for her on the computer, and it would just be a little text message. Becky, I left a sandwich for you in the fridge. She, when she came into work, could sign into the same computer, see that she had a message waiting, read it, and know that there was a sandwich supposedly waiting in the fridge for her. This system was very effective, and it sounds a lot like email, and for that reason it is often confused with it. But if you have not seen it, go back and watch my video on what is email, the first in this series. This does not meet either of the important qualifications for email. The one being an extremely hard line, email must be electronic communications between computer systems, otherwise there's no message being sent, right? And the other being that it needs to use a protocol for that, such as SMTP. In this case, there is no protocol being used, there's no networking being done, there's no sending between, there's no mail component. There is a message, but there is no mail. So if we were to compare this to real life, in that first video, we said that the email system was surprisingly analogous to the post system in real life, to mail delivery of the USPS or the British Post or whatever you're familiar with, where you actually take a letter, put it in an envelope, address it, give it to someone, and they send it. And we recognize in that system, like we said in that video, that it requires the carrier to pick up that message, and it's only emailed during the time it's in transit. Well, in the bulletin board system, there is no envelope, there is no addressing, there is no carrier, there's no picking up, no delivering, there is no duration of time during which there is a process whereby it is being delivered. It is simply being handed directly to that person instantly. So because of this, all of the aspects that make something mail, or in the electronic world, email, do not exist in a bulletin board system. It simply puts the message of whatever it is directly into the storage of that person, or storage designated for that person. That's really important, that it is an immediate thing. And that there's no transition between computers. It is a single computer system. So this is a fundamentally similar messaging mechanism for the end users. Well, I sit down at my computer, I send a message, they receive it. But to the computer system, everything is different. Other than the fact that there is a message, all the rest is very, very different. And that's pretty critical. And we're going to get into just how important this is in the next video. We're not going to dig into all the details on this one. That would be over the top. But we want to talk about this a little bit because this became a popular thing in the world before the common availability of the internet. The desire to send messages between people got very high. And so there started to be a way by which people could do this remotely. And this makes for some confusion because it starts to feel more and more like email, and for sure it was acting more and more like email. So in the later 80s and definitely in the 1990s, it became common for bulletin board services to be run for the public, no longer just inside a company or inside an organization or inside a government, but they started to be run publicly. And to give access to people to be able to use them, you would call the system over a modem. You would actually use a traditional landline, a 1960s to 1980s style analog landline. You would dial a phone number. The bulletin board system would have a bank of modems. It could be one modem, it could be 1,000 modems. You would actually dial in, connect directly. Keep in mind, there's no networking here. We're not connecting to a network. This is not like the internet. This is directly one computer calling another computer and making a direct serial connection through their modems. This is very different than anything we do today. This was very popular at one time, but today this is unheard of. So this is so weird that it actually becomes a little bit difficult to really visualize what is happening. This is a computer dialing into another computer. That computer it was common for small ones to only have 1 to 3 modems. And so if you were using the bulletin board, no one else could. You would have to wait for you to get done, see if there was a busy signal, wait till you could get through, and then check your messages, leave messages for other people, whatever. And you could do other things on the bulletin boards as well. Some of those systems had online encyclopedias or other kinds of research libraries. They may have video games that you could play or whatever. When you connected to these, this is important. In the bulletin board world, the way that it worked was that you would actually execute a remote shell. We did not have SSH like we do today during the majority of the bulletin board era, so we would use other mechanisms such as Telnet and RSH to enact a remote shell, but the basics were the same. It would be much like doing an SSH to a remote computer today that many people can do. So you can approximate bulletin board services today to see what they're like, and services still exist because they're incredibly simplistic. So if this is something you're interested in, you can go out and create one without any problem and see what it was like more or less. It's difficult to replicate the modem thing because no one has modems, no one has landlines, so that part, just make a bunch of sounds, play a tape of old modem sounds and pretend, right? But other than that, you still need to connect, you're still working from a single computer. So the thing that was interesting is when you had multiple users at the same time, is that they would all be dialing into the same computer. It'd be one computer with many modems on it. So all of those people would be simultaneously connected to the same computer. This was a really common modality for computing over a really long period of time. And it is still existent today. We still do it every day, but not to the same degree that they did long ago. Today, it is so easy to have independent computing power for everybody that we typically do. We have our own phones, we have our own desktops, we have our own laptops, all of them have super amounts of power. There's very little need to share the resources by actually running on the same computer as each other. So we generally don't. If you work in IT, you probably will, because you're going to have multiple people SSH'd into the same machine at some point or other. You may be using RDS in the Windows world. So the things still exist, but in general, it's become much less common, and so we don't think about it in the same way. But back then, it was quite important. All of these people will be on the same computer at the same time, sharing its resources. There's only one computer involved. If you had a computer at home that you were using to dial in for this, and you didn't necessarily need one, you could dial in using nothing but a terminal and a modem in some cases. The modem did all the heavy lifting of making the connection. The terminal simply sent the signal to display the text and send the keyboard, and that was it. It was essentially a teletype with a monitor, and that's where some of those early TTY naming conventions of terminals come from, because they actually were behaving as teletypes, but putting it on a screen instead of paper. And to be fair, if you wanted to do it on paper with an actual typewriter connected through teletype, you generally could. That would have been terrible, but you could. So all these people are sharing this computer, and people would dial up, and even if you had your own computer at home, like I was saying, it didn't use any of the resources of that computer. It simply used that computer as a display mechanism, just a keyboard and monitor. It didn't do any work. That local computer had no knowledge of what was happening. It didn't see the processing, it didn't run the code, nothing like that. It was simply acting as a digital typewriter with this teletype communications back to the central computer. While doing this, all these people sharing resources, you would leave a message. Other people who were doing this at the same time, maybe they're playing video games, maybe they're looking up an encyclopedia entry, they could get a notification someone has left a message for you. In some cases, they would get notified in more advanced systems. In more basic ones, when they were done with their encyclopedia research, done playing their text-based video game, their adventure game, that whatever, they would then be able to go check their messages with their message command, whatever it was, bring up and see if new messages had been left for them and leave any other messages that they wanted for other people. This was incredibly simplistic and powerful. So to them, at the time, because there wasn't servers that they were connected to all the time, because they weren't on the internet all the time, or at all in most cases, this functioned as email would have functioned at that time. Had they had email, it would have behaved very much the same. It would have had to have had multiple computers. There would have had to have been SMTP. There would have had to have been things behind the scenes. But to the end users, the effect would have been more or less the same. So that makes this pretty confusing as to what is and isn't email to an end user who is only seeing the text being sent and displayed. And yes, in one case they have to put @ and the name of a host, in one case they don't. But to a lot of users, that's not something they're going to notice or be cognizant of that change. It's simply going to be one address or another, and that's how they're going to see it. So bulletin board systems played a really important role in the early building of communications paradigms, in establishing how message communications were expected to work, where people became used to using it, and so forth. And bulletin board systems, for the most part, died out with the advent of the internet. Early bulletin board systems, such as CompuServe and AOL, who were very late players, who were at the point where these have become giant organizations and not just small little, sometimes bulletin boards were just a guy in his basement with a couple modems or one modem and offering a tiny little service running off of his tiny little computer. They were very, very limited. But some large companies arose, like America Online and CompuServe, who ran enormous bulletin board systems. And all of these in the late 1990s became gateways, or all of these types, not every single service, became gateways to the internet. So bulletin board systems became some of the first mechanisms for people to get internet access, which we're not going to dig too much into now, but it's an interesting bit of the history that because you were already dialing into the service, because that service already had messages and other things you wanted, and because they already were putting multiple people onto the same computer, it was often relatively trivial for them to then get large, fast internet pipes, which at the time were often things like ISDN, or really big services might get a T1, and allow many people to dial into a bulletin board service and then get some of the services from that computer. You might still have the bulletin board messaging, you might still have the local video games, you might still have the local encyclopedia, and more things were gathered that way. But they would also offer the ability to get onto the internet. So suddenly the idea that you could send a message to someone on another bulletin board system, or on a system that is not a bulletin board system, became plausible, and email became one of the very first potential applications to roll out on this interconnected world of bulletin board systems that were on the internet. Keep in mind, not everyone was on the internet with a bulletin board system. That was just one way that a lot of people ended up getting online early, because they were already using these services, and these services simply tacked on internet access. And AOL famously ran a giant number of services that people used heavily, and even when they added the internet to it, the internet portion of AOL remained relatively small for a very long time. And some of their bulletin board services, like AOL Instant Messenger, lingered long past the otherwise demise of the platform. And so there was a lot of interesting history with bulletin boards and how it played into other things. Bulletin boards also spawned online video games that stood on their own and kind of diverged from bulletin boards. And so original bulletin boards tended to have, pretty commonly, some amount of video games built into them. Later, video games took the lead and started building bulletin board systems into the video games, so that instead of connecting to a bulletin board and one of the things you could do being playing a video game, it's that you could play a video game that acted like a bulletin board, and inside the video game you could leave messages for people in the same way, making itself a bulletin board. This is very interesting. Now, I wanted to say this. I started saying it and I got distracted. In our physical analog with email, we talked about the post and mail delivery. We call these bulletin board systems because its analog is actually a bulletin board, where you would walk up and tack messages onto a board and people could come by and read it. This is not quite how most of the systems work. The very earliest systems did do this. It was just public announcements. So you had to say, Becky, sandwich in the fridge for you, but other people could read it and be like, haha, fridge has a sandwich, we're going to go in there, and Becky will never know because I'll delete this message before she gets here. That didn't work for very long, obviously, but that was the foundations of the messaging systems. What quickly became the case is that individual mailboxes were created, whether it was a folder on the file system or a designation within a database, and that database could be as simple as just a flat text file that held all the text of the messages and just had a header that said Becky and then that message, or Becky and a timestamp and that message, or whatever. So these systems could be pretty simple, they could be pretty complex, but they did start implementing the idea that you needed to log in, identify yourself, prove who you were, at least a little bit, before you could pick up your messages, because otherwise people would mess with you and you wouldn't necessarily get what you thought, and you wouldn't know who sent it because you could just claim anyone had sent something because you had control of everything. So quickly, those mechanisms came into play, and that's where a lot of the mechanisms that we know today actually originated, not through some other place, and we're going to get to that in the next video, why they would have not come from email, but why they may have come from bulletin board systems by and large. Now you may say, I've never seen a bulletin board, that's a really antiquated thing. The late 1990s, when they were dying out, was more than a quarter century ago. By 1997, they were already very much on the way out. By 1994, they were competing with the internet to the point where I actually never used a bulletin board system, but I did use the MUDs, which are the video games built like them. So I have some amount of the experience of it, but even growing up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s when they were most prevalent, I was in an area of the country where telephone lines were incredibly expensive, and doing things like dialing into a bulletin board system would have been outrageous. There's no way we would reasonably have done it. The internet was so much cheaper when it came along that going directly to the internet and bypassing the bulletin board world is what ended up making sense. But I did use the bulletin boards when they were connected over the internet via things like CircleMud, which was very interesting, and so I did have a bit of interaction with it. So the MUDs, you can go see, I have a video from a couple of years ago that talks about MUDs, multi-user dungeons, and I think it's pretty interesting if you've never played one or looked into one before. It's a really interesting piece of video game history and an interesting part of the overall IT ecosystem from a historical perspective. And so I think it's worth checking out, and there are some you can go run today, and they can be really fun. I still like them a lot. It is still text-based. That's what makes it a MUD. That's what makes it interesting. All that said, the heyday of the bulletin board systems really started wrapping up in the mid-1990s. Once people were getting onto the internet, once there was email easily available for people, the goals of the bulletin board system started to fade. And yes, they clung to life for a little while because they provided modem banks for many people to get onto the internet. It became popular to have just, if you lived in a small town, there'd be that one guy who had modems in his basement. You would dial into his house, he would get you online. That was a big thing in the late 90s, even past 2000. But really quickly, once the idea of broadband to the home started to roll out, those systems were gone practically overnight, and the entire ecosystem of bulletin boards evaporated. But a few important products on the market lingered on or replaced them and actually play the same role. We're going to talk a whole bunch about some in our next video, but in this one I want to talk about a couple that are really important and are still around that you may not think about because they've changed their names to at least some degree. One is there's a more modern take on the traditional bulletin board. So first of all, you can just go run an old bulletin board if you want. Like I said, you can connect over SSH or something similar, so you have the same experience that you used to have. Text and remote onto a single computer, fine. But that no longer makes sense in most cases. That's mostly for nostalgic reasons, but some people still want what was the functionality of a bulletin board replicated today using modern technologies. And the most common, by far, tool for that is PHP BB. This is a bulletin board system that runs on PHP. You run it like a web server, and basically it gives you a traditional bulletin board experience, but with a web interface. Of course, bulletin board systems today almost always implement email in some way so they can send you an alert so you know to go to the bulletin board to go interact because something has happened, which kind of is weird because much of the point of the old bulletin boards was to not have to be connected to other computer systems, but in today's world that doesn't really make sense, so they've adapted. So they still exist and all your interactions happen on a single computer, but they now have hooks into the outside world for notifications and such. So PHP BB is a really popular one, but others exist as well, such as BB Press, which is a bulletin board layer that goes on top of WordPress, if that's something you're interested in. I run NodeBB, which is another bulletin board system. I've run this for almost an entire decade. I've gotten tens of thousands of users with millions of hits per month, and it is a very modern messaging platform used for basically the same thing. So while the era of the traditional bulletin board ended in the mid-90s and lingered for a little bit longer, by 2014 I actually had reason to get involved in a really large bulletin board, which is mangolasi.it, or you can find it at republicofit.com. It is a bulletin board system, or discussion forum, as we often call them now. That is where that's primarily what they morphed into. So for those who are familiar with the professional forum at Spiceworks, for example, or Stack Overflow, or republicofit.com/mangolasi.it, all of those are modern evolutions of the traditional bulletin board system, servicing the same functionality. All of them are a single platform where all the users are logged into that, leaving messages for each other. All of them have modernized with the ability to send email alerts. All of them are written on modern technology. All of them use web interfaces and so forth. Under the hood, they're all bulletin board systems at heart. And that's really interesting and important. There's also a few larger platforms that have been out there, and many actually over the years, but really important examples of systems that have followed the same paradigm and have just modernized so much that we don't identify them in this way, include many years ago MySpace, and today Facebook. What makes Facebook different? It doesn't offer email. That's not something you can use through it. It's a web interface where you can leave messages for each other on a single system. Now they're very large, so they use multiple computers, but those multiple computers work as a single computer. It's a single platform. It's not sending messages between those different computers. It is one giant system. It is simply spread out for reliability, for geographic performance, for computational power, but it is not used as individual platforms sending messages between them. It is a single giant messaging platform, and so using things like Facebook Messenger and their forum systems are two different aspects of message storing within a bulletin board system. It's one that's extremely fast, it behaves like other things, so it makes it hard to identify as a bulletin board system, but that's actually what it is. A really modern one, but fundamentally a bulletin board system. One that anyone can use and is giant and free, but still very different. So that is where bulletin boards have gone in the mainstream. And next time we're going to talk about where they went in the messaging world. Thanks for joining me. Before we go on, I just want to say real quickly, this video is sponsored by my employer, ntg.co. If you're interested in learning more about outsourcing IT or finding an IT department that can help augment your existing IT team, whether you're just looking for additional help desk help or you need CIO services, someone who can consult with your owners or your C-suite, sit in the boardroom and discuss high-level strategies, a team that can handle Linux, Windows administration, networking, security, whatever aspect of IT you need to supplement for your team or your organization. That is what we've been doing for a quarter of a century. Reach out to us at sales@ntg.co. That's co, not .com. It's only 5 letters, very short, ntg.co. We'll pop it up on the screen right here so you can see it. And that's where I've been working since 1999. We pride ourselves not only on being a full-range IT supplier, we also are not a reseller. We resell absolutely nothing. All of our solutions are our own. We are IT. We represent only our customers. So especially if you're looking for email or similar types of support communications for your organization, we've been running email for the largest organizations in the world for a very, very long time. We would love to help your organization with that or any other technology needs as well. Thanks for joining me. If you'd like to support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller. That comes directly to me. It's like Patreon, and you can just make a donation, and it helps me pay for the time to do this, the research, the film equipment, the processing. I need a computer for doing editing and all those kinds of things. That helps quite a lot. And I have to mention, I did write a book. I mention this every video, Linux Administration Best Practices by Pact Publishing. It is available on Amazon. That is the very first book that I've ever published in print in that way, and I'm very proud of the work that we did on that. And I would love if you guys bought that, whether electronic, digital, or in print. That would be fantastic. I really appreciate all of the support. And as always, like and subscribe, tell others about the show, share on social media, and I will see all of you next time.